They call it making life affordable, but what if that affordability is actually a trap? Because with every easy payment plan, 50-year mortgage, or $0 down payment plan, someone's getting rich, but chances are it's probably not you. So in this video, I'm going to be doing two things. First, I'm going to show you how the system keeps you stuck, and second, I'm going to show you how to break free. With that, let's jump in. As always, I would really appreciate it if you like this video and if you subscribe to my channel, especially if you learned something new. So with that, let's talk about the illusion of affordability, because believe it or not, it really is an illusion. People think something's affordable, but in reality, it's not. And the first example here are the buy now, pay later plans that we are probably pretty familiar with. For example, there's this app called Klarna, which has become pretty popular, buy now, pay later, and it is actually doing quite well. Now, let's move on to the pros and cons of buy now, pay later. So as you can see, pros are, in terms of cash flow, it actually lowers the amount of cash expenditure that you have. But there are a lot of cons, and without going through this entire list, the biggest one really is that it just adds to how much you owe and adds to your debt. You don't really want to do that, and you want to try to stay away, especially from bad debt, as much as possible. And the key thing here is that the longer you stretch a payment, which really again relates to this buy now, pay later idea, the more profit you're giving to the system, right? You're not giving yourself profit in your own pocket, you're giving profit to the system. That's exactly why a lot of people utilize these systems, right? So they utilize Klarna, for example, or ClearPay or whatnot. They utilize credit cards, which is also a very similar idea to this buy now, pay later. And the reason why some people do this is because they maybe don't have the cash up front to buy an asset. And so they take on debt, or they take on this buy now, pay later approach. And while in some cases it might help, especially if you have an appreciating asset, oftentimes people buy things like clothes or handbags or things of that nature that depreciate quite rapidly over time. So it's a depreciating asset that actually devalues your overall net worth and increases the amount of debt that you owe. And you're essentially perpetuating this system that, is feeding off of this buy now, pay later plan. So an example here is moving to the 50-year mortgage. So as you may know, the 50-year mortgage has been at least the idea has been announced, and there are some pros, absolutely, and there's also some cons. And my goal with this video is to just give you enough information so you can make your own decision, but it's also well informed, and we're looking at the math as well. So here's the example. Let's say you're thinking of buying a house for $400,000 and you're deciding between a mortgage of 50 years, which is in the plan, or a mortgage of 30 years, which is pretty common at this point, right? We also have 15-year mortgages, 10-year mortgages, but 30 years is probably the most common. So right away, the first thing I'm thinking about, at least drawing from my own financial advisor background, is the longer you extend a certain payment plan, like 50 years, the more money you're going to be paying to the banks, right? Or to the system in general. So again, going back to this concept that I shared with you up here, the more profit you give to the system, the longer you stretch out the payment, right? So that is the truth. And that also applies with mortgages. It applies with buy now, pay later schemes, et cetera, et cetera. So how does this translate into actual dollars and cents? Let's check it out. The new financial trap, before we jump into the dollars and cents actually, is not so much high interest, even though we are paying relatively high interest, at least given the current environment. It's more so slow interest. And again, this kind of takes this 50-year approach to the mortgage industry. So let's take a look at it. So I divided the 50-year mortgage payment just using this regular loan calculator that you can find online. And I typed in a loan amount of $400,000. So this is how much loan we actually need to buy a house. This assumes a $0 down payment, right? So you're just getting immediately a $400,000 loan. This here is the average term for 30 years at 6%. I use 6% because it seems to be hovering, or has hovered relatively for a couple of months now around that 6% marker. If you do it yourself, feel free to change the interest rate. But the point is, over a 30-year period with 6% interest and a $400,000 loan, you're looking at a total payment of about $860,000 over that 30-year term period. Total interest is just over half of that amount. And now let's take a look of how that would look like with a 50-year mortgage. Okay, so with a 50-year mortgage, again, our loan term is 50 years at the same interest rate. So we're really comparing apples to apples, and we're just looking at the different year and the same loan amount, $400,000. Now we're taking a look at the total payment. So there's 600 total payments because of the extended 20-year term from 30 to 50 years. And we're looking at a total of about 1.2 million, 1.3 million if we're rounding it up over that 50-year term. And the total interest, which I thought was interesting too, is $860,000. So of the 1.3 million that you're paying, 860K is just interest versus here of the 860 that you're paying, you're actually paying 460 in interest. So pretty interesting. The other thing I want you to pay attention to is this monthly payment. So this is how much you're actually spending in cash each month for your mortgage, right? Or for, in general, it's like the principal and the interest that you're paying. And that's $2,400 roughly per month, right? So this is what we're looking at, $2,400 a month with a 30-year term. On the other hand, with a 50-year term, you're looking at $2,100, okay? So you are looking at lower cash flow expenses. Okay, so the cash flow difference is about $293 a month. And I think, there are some pros and cons to this. First of all, you don't have to pay, you save essentially $293 a month by going with a 50-year mortgage over a 30-year mortgage, which makes sense. You're condensing a payment, a $400,000 loan, in 30 years versus stretching it out over 50 years. So that means your cash flow is lower over a 50-year period versus a 30-year period. So you save money, if you want to put that in quotation marks. That annualized is about $3,500 a year. Now here's the question. Would you be a person that essentially spends all of that excess money, the $293 a month in quote savings, or would you do something different with that $293 saved per month? So my question is, what happens if you actually invest the saved money? And if we follow this approach, and again, I used a very simple calculator that you can access online and kind of change around the calculations as well, you can actually see that this 50-year mortgage plan could actually play in your favor. It could also not play in your favor. It really depends on your personality and what you use the money for. So let's take a look at what happens if you actually invest this quote saved money. And again, by saved money, we're referencing this $300 basically a month. Okay. So again, I went into this calculator, this interest, actually compounding interest calculator. And as you can see, we're starting with nothing. So this here assumes that you're not investing anything. And this assumes you're going for the 50-year mortgage over 50 years. And we're assuming a 9% return because that is what the stock market, typically the S&P 500 has typically returned over the last 50 years. Actually, it's between 8 to 10%, so I use the middle 9%. Obviously, that's an average. Some years are better, some years are worse, but on average, that is 9% over the last 50 years. So it is pretty relevant, right? It, again, works well with this 50-year time frame. We're compounding it annually. And now I'm saying we're adding $293 because if we're looking, I'm going to zoom out here. If we're looking at the $293 that we quote unquote saved because of that lower cash flow for the 50-year over the 30-year term mortgage, I'm going to say we're investing that quote saved cash flow. And we're going to contribute that at the beginning of each month. And it does make a difference whether you contribute at the beginning or the end. And since you pay a mortgage normally at the beginning of each month, I said you're going to contribute into your investment account at the beginning of each month. So those are kind of the necessary requirements that I put in here for this chart. And you can see that the calculations are pretty interesting. Your end balance is about $3 million. So your total contributions are about $175K. So this is all of the quote saved cash flow that you have. And you made roughly $3 million over that 50-year period. So obviously $3 million is more than what you would have had to pay in additional interest, this $863,000 versus the $463,000. Now, what can we do with this $3 million? Now, there's a couple of ways to think about this. Sure, it's $3 million. Now, some people might, of course, say, okay, well, if I paid off, the mortgage faster in 30 years, then I could use that saved money that I didn't actually spend for the mortgage and, invest that instead. And I could probably make up the $3 million marker as well. And that's absolutely true. I would just say that the caveat here is that, especially as you're paying off a 30-year mortgage over a 50-year mortgage, oftentimes we're in the beginning of our careers. Maybe we have kids to feed, or, we have growing families, and typically expenses are generally quite high, paying off debt, student loan debt, etc. Toward the beginning of our lifespan. Also, our earning potential is probably lower in the first 20 years or 10 years of our careers versus the later 10 years or later 20 years of our careers. So chances are maybe you won't be able to make those investments as you could with a 50-year mortgage plan. Because in the 50-year mortgage plan, you're essentially forced to save the $293 a month versus in the 30-year mortgage plan, you would have to spend much more in the cash flow department. So you would have to spend more on your mortgage, higher cash flow by $300 a month. And then the question is, do you have any surplus cash available to invest in, the stock market, for example, because probably expenses are generally a little bit higher. If you are someone that is very diligent and you are very focused on your finances, then certainly a 30-year mortgage would probably be the better choice. Also, just financially speaking, because you're paying less in interest. The 50-year mortgage, on the other hand, and there's a lot of cons with that as well, which we'll review here in a second. The 50-year mortgage really is, I would say, kind of a way to extend your money to keep your own cash flow low so you can spend your money on something else, right? So whether that's on your lifestyle or whether that's putting it toward the investment category or whatnot. This here, in my opinion, would probably only make sense if you do use that, quote, saved cash flow and invest it. Otherwise, I personally would steer clear of the 50-year mortgage, especially if I do have the cash flow to pay for my mortgage in a truncated period of time, which is the 30-year mortgage. So that's something to think about. Again, the 50-year mortgage isn't necessarily bad. It's just about how you approach it and how you view the money and what you do with that saved money if your cash flow is lowered. So before moving on, I just wanted to say, if you think this is interesting, you want to learn more, make sure you sign up to my email list, which is in the pinned comment on the bottom. Now, moving on, it is really important to stay vigilant because while I did want to share this point up above, 50-year mortgages, not always the best. Specifically, I want you to follow this framework called the fake framework. This is, again, assuming that you spend the saved cash flow. You're not really investing it. You're not doing anything proactive with a saved cash flow. And the fake framework stands for these 4 letters. The first letter, F, stands for fragment the cost. This is specifically what the banks are doing, right? So there's a huge price tag, like the $400K, and they typically just chop this price tag into smaller costs, so it's harder for you to actually notice how much you're paying over time, especially when interest is calculated into that payment. The A stands for anchor the emotion. And specifically, they try to pull you in to buy these houses or maybe cars or whatnot because they say that you deserve whatever that asset is. Or maybe it's not an asset, it's a liability, probably more so, especially if it's a car, right? So the question is, and oftentimes a lot of marketing agencies actually use ads like this that say you deserve this, and they're hoping that you will spend the money and take on the extra debt and pay the interest for this asset because of that emotion, which is very scary because oftentimes we do deserve these assets, but maybe we shouldn't actually spend the money on it. The K stands for keep you paying. They want to keep you paying every additional year, and every extra year adds more profit to the banks, right? So again, the 50-year mortgage, we saw the difference in interest payments. A 20-year difference makes like $400K in difference in interest payments alone. So again, you're adding more profit to the banks and less profit to your own wallet. And then the E stands for erode your wealth slowly. So this K and E really come together. They really work hand in hand because you're giving more profit to the banks. And the real trick here is to try and avoid the loan entirely, if possible. Again, if you're extending how long you owe the banks, you are giving them profit. You get the convenience of a lowered cash flow, right? Because your cash flow or your cash outflow, I would say, is actually decreased. But for that, the banks, they get the compound returns and your bank account does not, or your investment account does not. So that's a huge con. And again, I think this particular 50-year mortgage likely applies to those people that maybe aren't as able to afford houses, and they're looking for a house to afford with a lower cash outflow. And unfortunately, that means that they are actually paying more over that 50-year term than the 30-year term. So is it the best option to move forward? No, unless, again, you're very wise about the money that you spend and invest. And I would suggest that you try a wealth shift. Here's what this framework says. First, always watch your cash flow, right? Where do you have money leaks? Does that include subscriptions? Does that include something else like unnecessary bills, for example? Are you paying interest on credit card payments? Can you pay off that credit card right away? E stands for eliminate unproductive debt. Pay off anything that doesn't earn or protect you, anything that essentially is a liability. Acquire assets early. Especially if you're 20 years old or 25 years old, use fractional investing to help you build wealth. Leverage intentionally. Yes, you can use debt, but only when it builds wealth. So yeah, sure, you could probably argue a house can likely build wealth for you long term. Now you just have to figure out what is the best type of mortgage for you. Is it a 50-year mortgage? Probably not so much, again, because I'm thinking of the interest cost. Is it the 30-year mortgage? Probably. The T stands for think long-term. Long-term is the only term that will build you wealth. And then finally, the H stands for hedge your risk. So for example, have an emergency fund. So you have something that's like a liquidity buffer, right? And then you want to have insurance. Do you have insurance on yourself, especially if you're married or you have a partnership with someone, like you have a partner in life and you depend on their salary, or maybe vice versa, they depend on your salary, or you have a child or whatnot. Make sure that you have the appropriate insurance. And then diversify in general. Like, are you asset rich and cash poor, which is absolutely a thing? Do you have too much house, but maybe not enough cash on hand because all of your money is actually tied up in your house? That's not the right way either. Even if your house is worth $4 million, if you only have like $500 of cash on hand, if you need maintenance repairs, it's probably not going to be that easy to get a home equity line of credit, because that generally takes a month. What if there's a leak? You need to get that fixed right away. You know, there are certain drawbacks. So always make sure that you are diversified. And then I want you to try the affordability test. In other words, can you pay for this house or whatever asset it is 2 times over? If the answer is no, then maybe rethink. Now, of course, for a house, maybe the story is a little bit different, because houses oftentimes are quite expensive. We're talking in the several hundreds of thousands category. And perhaps when you're in your 20s or 30s buying that house, you might not actually have the cash to pay for it 2 times over. That's probably a different story, especially because a house is generally considered a wealth building asset. So perhaps exclude that from this first question. But if you're thinking of buying other things like a car or other things of that nature, you might want to ask yourself that question. The next question is, will this make me freer or richer? If the answer is no, then you know you're actually getting a liability rather than an asset. The goal is to build your life with assets, not so much liabilities. And then finally, if my income stopped tomorrow, could I still keep it? Now, this is the question, the age-old question, you know, are you buying too much house, for example? I know a lot of folks that are trying to buy houses for status symbols. Maybe that's not necessarily the right next step for you. Is an apartment maybe better? I know a lot of people, they put apartment living down, but I don't really know about that. I mean, apartments give you a lot of flexibility. You don't have to worry about maintenance costs. Trust me, when with my house, I had to pay for the roof. I had to pay for new air conditioning. I had to pay for a new refrigerator. The plumbing also was going old, and that was going to cost another $25,000. So like it is a lot of money. And, you know, you just have to be able to think, do you have enough cash on hand, or would that cause you to go into debt? And what type of debt would that be? So really plan this out and think about it systematically. Apartment living isn't always that bad. So it depends on your needs and your lifestyle. And the one thing I would keep in mind here is that cheap is often the most expensive word in finance. So for example, this goes back to that 50-year mortgage. 50-year mortgage, right? Essentially, it is cheap because of the low cash flow or the cash outflow. And we saw that it's about $300 cheaper, right? Less expensive. But if you're unable and not disciplined with that decrease in money, well, then in cash outflow, then maybe it's actually costing you a lot more. And we saw those numbers specifically. We saw that it was about a $400,000 difference in interest alone that you're paying for the extended 20-year mortgage, the extended 20 years in the 50-year mortgage. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, as that old saying goes. So with that, just make sure to start building wealth now. Think it through slowly and wisely and ask yourself what are the pros and cons, and really give yourself a reality check with what your personality is. Are you someone that spends money right away and are not disciplined, especially if you have a cash flow break, like with a 50-year mortgage? 50-year mortgages are probably not right for you. And in general, 50-year mortgages are probably not the best option. If you can afford a 30-year mortgage, I would go with a 30-year mortgage because you're saving so much money in the long run. If you found this video helpful, please like and share to help others. And make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's at @_MMW for more cool insights. And make sure you join my newsletter. That is in the pinned comment below. Your bank accounts will thank you later. Thanks, guys.